Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. Bex here today to share my BookTube Prize Octofinals ranking. I was assigned to Nonfiction Group G, and I was very pleased with the selection of books that I got this year. On initial look, it seemed like each one of them was generally interesting to me, and I'm happy to say I am pleased with this group. It was definitely better than the one I got last year. So with the BookTube Prize, you have to read the 6 books in your designated section, and then you rank them from 1 to 6. With 1 being the best and 6 being the worst. And so because I found this Octofinals group to be quite strong, even the book in 6th place is not a bad book. I would still recommend it to you if this sounds like something you would be interested in. The 6th book for me was The Agitators, 3 Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights by Dorothy Wickenden. This talks about Harriet Tubman, who's probably the name you're going to know of the 3, and then also Frances Seward, whose husband became the Secretary of State under President Abraham Lincoln, and then also Martha Coffin Wright, who was a Quaker mother. You may be wondering how these 3 women's lives interconnect, and that's what Dorothy does in this book. She shows you how that happens. I did think this was a cool angle to write from, something that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily come across in a history textbook, so I thought it was cool that Dorothy picked up on this and was able to weave these 3 women's stories together in a way. It reminded me of some of that US history knowledge that I'd gotten in school, kind of refreshed my memory on things, so that was fun to have moments of like, oh, I remember learning about this, and now I've got a bit of a different angle on it. It was frustrating to see how hard these women were working all those years ago, and to know that it took so much longer for women in the US to get the right to vote, at least on a federal level. And it was cool to see the arc of the fight for abolition too, because this book does kind of encircle the Civil War, and so you see the Emancipation Proclamation and what happened after the Civil War ended. So you can kind of see that arc being concluded, but when you finish the book, there's still not that success for women's rights that they were hoping for. The reason this book is in 6th place is because I do think it had some flaws that were on the heavier side, one of them being that the book focused a lot on the Civil War, and so there were points where the author was writing about Civil War battles and just giving us a lot of detail that I didn't think needed to be in there, considering the focus of the book was on the women. It's one thing to say that their sons were off fighting in this war and you know, they were worried about them, they were writing letters to them, but to actually spend the amount of time that she did giving us all of these details, it felt like she had done the research, and so she wanted to be able to put that research into the book. I do think that part of it could have been cut down. There was also a lot of names. Martha, the Quaker mother, she has 7 children, and so you hear all these different names, never mind Frances's children. You hear all their different names, and it's really hard to keep track of who's who, so if there had been family trees at the beginning or the end of this book, that would have been super helpful. The other thing is, although this was a good idea, an interesting idea for a book, I do think that it was sort of lopsided in who had the most written about them. Frances Seward, who kind of grew up in higher society. Her husband was in the political sphere. He was a governor. Like I said, he became Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln. So Frances seemed to have the most to be written about her, probably because she had so much correspondence and she was so prevalent at that time with the circles that she was hanging out in. I really do feel like Dorothy wanted to write a book about Frances Seward and it just wasn't quite good enough, and so she decided to sort of take this angle, and by combining 3 women's storylines together, especially Harriet Tubman, that was maybe enough to make it work, like enough for them to say, yep, we'll publish that book if you write it. Martha probably had the next most written about her because she was also writing letters, and although she was not in such a big public sphere, there was still a lot of stuff to pull from. And then Harriet Tubman, who is the most popular of the 3, but I do feel like there was the least amount of stuff on her, probably because she wasn't writing letters and hanging out with high society people all the time. She was gone for months helping slaves cross into Canada, or even just, you know, across the Mason-Dixon line. And so although she's kind of like the main interesting pull of this book, there was not nearly as much on her there. So there's just that sort of like the difference in weight of how much time you spend with each of them. It felt a little weird to say 3 friends who fought for abolition of women's rights, because they cross paths and they ask things of each other, but it's not like they're all writing to each other all the time. And I do think Harriet felt like the odd one out of the group, but because she had the most pull as a name, it made sense to put her in here. So that's why this book is in 6th place. I just thought it was an interesting idea, but maybe it was oversold a bit. In 5th place, I had Punch Me Up to the Gods by Brian Broome. This is a memoir that has mostly some coming of age aspect to it, but there is a little bit after what you would normally refer to as coming of age. For quite a while, I didn't know how to feel about this book because the formatting was really cool. The way he broke up the chapters, it was based on a Gwendolyn Brooks poem, and he was using the lines of the poem to have the different chapters of the book. And I really liked how that worked. That was just a cool idea that came together for me. I do like how some of the passages were told in different ways. One of them was sort of like a diary entry from when he was in middle school, and you could tell that he had written it a while ago because the writing style was very much how somebody would write at that age, just the way they were formatting their sentences versus what he was writing in other parts of the book. It made sense, it lined up for me. And then he also had one point where he did a section that was like from the point of view of his mom. He had another time where he was intercutting 2 different stories, like paragraph by paragraph, to illustrate what was going on. And then, so you have these parts that are about him, and then in between those chapters that have the headlines that go with the lines of the Gwendolyn Brooks poem, he is talking about observations that he's making on this one bus ride and about this little boy. Because this book is all about the expectations of growing up as a Black man. His father was very much of the mindset that you needed to be masculine and you needed to play sports, and that's not Brian at all. He was often hanging out with girls. He wanted to play with dolls. He wanted to dress up in his sister's clothes, and that made his father very upset. So he had a lot of physical abuse given to him as a child because of the choices that he made when he was little. And he definitely had a hard life, and just growing up in the poverty that he grew up in, and then also his choice with like drugs and alcohol and how that sent him into a spiral. Although it didn't quite end on like a happy note, it seemed to sort of be a more positive ending, so I'm hoping things are better for him now than what he was dealing with in the book. The reason this is in the 5th spot is because, one, the book has an unnecessary intro, in my opinion. He had a friend of his write an introduction to this book, and it felt like the kind of intro you would put on a classic. Like if you were picking up Jane Eyre and it was a beautiful edition of the book, and because it's been 100+ years since this book was written, someone has put an intro into it to kind of talk about maybe the social impact of this book, how it's changed, literature, things like that. This book, published last year, had an intro that talked about Punch Me Up to the Gods, this book, like it had been out for years and it had made this huge cultural impact, or like that it will make this huge cultural impact. And it just felt odd. Like, why would you put that into a book that's just being published? It felt like, give it 20 years and see how this book does, and then you can stick an intro in front of it. The other thing about this book is that I didn't quite get where Brian is in his life now. There was a little bit of a hint in the acknowledgments about some stuff that he'd made progress on, but so much about this book was about him going through all of this shit, drugs, alcohol, and him, you know, making bad decisions. And then we have this book on the other side of it. And I wasn't quite sure how we got from this version of Brian to the Brian who got this book published. The bit at the end, it has him going to France because he's finally got enough money to buy a plane ticket to go overseas, and he wants to write to be like James Baldwin. And I could see like, okay, we're heading in that direction, but there was that disconnect there. And I'm sitting there thinking, is this the turning point where he then goes on to write this book and tries to make better decisions where he can get to having a completed product and getting it published? I don't know. It was just strange to have all of this book, and then at the very end, maybe we have a hint of some good stuff happening, but then where's the rest of it? Like, did things turn out okay? How are you now? And the only reason I know a little bit more about it is because it would happen to be in the acknowledgments. So that's why this book is number 5. Number 4 in my ranking is A World on the Wing, The Global Odyssey of Migratory Birds by Scott Weidensaul. This one has the best cover of the bunch. I love looking at this cover. This one is about, as you would expect, migratory birds. Scott Weidensaul is a birder. He has written other books on birds before, so this is not his first foray into this area. But I am not somebody who has a particular interest in birds, so I wasn't so sure how I was going to feel going into this book. I will say that I started off trying to read it in physical format and it was not working for me, so I switched to an audiobook, and that was definitely helpful. I found as the book went on, I got more into it and I became more engrossed in his stories. Scott has traveled all over the world helping with research on different migratory birds. The book is kind of broken up into the chapters focusing on those different areas that he's been to. So you get to spend time in the Yellow Sea, Florida, Cyprus, a bunch of other places. And so you get a nice variety of stories related to what's going on there, the birds that they're following, sort of the cultural and environmental impact of these birds, a lot about climate change as well. I did find myself sort of glazing over a bit when he was getting into those nitty-gritty bird facts. Sometimes it felt repetitive too, because although there are different species of birds, they all are still birds. And so there were some facts that I felt like I'd already heard them before, and I feel like I actually did hear them, and it was just being applied to another bird species. So that was sort of the nitty-gritty part of the book that I wasn't into as much, but I did like him talking about what was going on in the sort of cultural environmental side of it, like legislation, climate change, and also I did get some really cool bird facts, like learning things about these birds that travel thousands and thousands of miles, sometimes flying for like 8 or 9 days at a time without stopping, and how they can shut down half their brain while they're flying, like really cool things like that. Those are the kind of facts I like learning about. This would be a book, if you are a bird fan, this is a great book for you because it's got a lot of cool stuff and it does get into that nitty-gritty. If you're like me and it's not so much your thing, this book isn't really worth your time, but I don't regret reading it because I did learn some cool stuff. There was nothing wrong with this book, it's just that the topic wasn't as interesting to me. Now on to my top 3. In 3rd place, I put All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake by Tiya Miles. This is the definition of a deep dive. This book is about a sack that a mother named Rose, who was enslaved, gave to her daughter Ashley when Ashley was sold away from her. The only reason we know that Rose gave Ashley the sack is that a few generations down the line, Ashley's granddaughter actually sewed, like stitched these words onto the sack itself to give this snippet of her family history. The sack was then lost for many years and then turned up at a flea market semi-recently, and now it's in a museum, and Tiya Miles was told about this sack. She went to go see it and sort of became almost obsessed with the idea of it and what it stood for. Tiya then does a deep dive into the different aspects surrounding this sack. So not only the sack itself and its manufacture, but also what was said to be in the sack. So a dress, a lock of hair, pecans, and then she takes each of those particular things and really expands on them and talks about like the dress. She talks about the fabric and what slaves wore at that time, talks about the sack itself and what the sack would have been used for and why a slave would have had a spare sack around, talking about locks of hair and how that was a thing back then for people to have locks of hair from other people, family members that were alive or dead. Tiya had to do a ton of research for this because there was not that much information about Rose and Ashley and their family from then on, because they were enslaved and they were not at the time keeping records really of enslaved people, like nothing about who they were. It was more just in ledgers of white slave owners' ledgers of how much their slaves cost, or like things that they gave them, food and clothing and whatnot. And so that's a whole aspect of this book too, how there's just not that information there. So she had to do so much research to be able to really give us a story. And even then, a lot of it is inferred, which I think might have frustrated some readers. It didn't bother me. Like I knew what I was getting into, but I think if you have a particular thought about where this book is going to go, you might be a bit sad that she still had to infer so much of it. But it was impressive to me, and I really found getting that like social history of slavery very specifically in South Carolina fascinating, because I've obviously learned about slavery in the US on a more general scale, but to have it so focused on how it came to South Carolina and how things there were as bad as they were, like very particularly South Carolina, it kind of helped connect some dots for me, and I appreciated that. The author comes from an academic side of things, so this book is more academic leaning, and there are some sections that are more interesting than others, just by the nature of all these different things that she's talking about, but I really enjoyed it. So that's why I got the third spot. In second place, I put Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford. This is also a memoir. This one is about growing up poor and Black in Indiana. This has a lot about Ashley and her relationship with her mother and her grandmother specifically, but also stuff about boys, like boys she's romantically interested in, and then also her father. The only downside of this book has nothing to do with Ashley herself. It's whoever wrote the blurb for the book really made it sound like this was going to spend a lot more time reflecting on Ashley and her relationship with her father, who has been in prison for almost all of her life. And that was not the case. It was much more about Ashley and her mother and Ashley and her grandmother. So because that blurb was misleading, I had to sort of reset my expectations on this book as I was going through, but still I had a really good time with it. Ashley gave us so much information, and I really feel like she sort of bared her soul to us on the page, like the stuff that she went through. She was physically abused by her mom, she was sexually assaulted, and just all of the trauma side of it, and like why her dad is in prison, but then also just being a girl growing up and wanting to do things with your friends and actually being able to go to university and what that was like, and sort of showing us where she is now a bit too, because there are the book starts kind of more present day and then goes back in time and shows us more things as she's growing up. And I loved her writing style. It worked for me. I felt all those emotions with Ashley. That frustration, the pain on her behalf, and just reading about the stuff that she went through. It was hard sometimes to read it too, but I thought it was so well presented that's why this book had to be in the second spot. In the number one slot, I put Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty by Patrick Radden Keefe. This was the one book from this group that I was already interested in reading, so it's certainly not a shock that it's my number one, because I already had my eye on it. But Patrick Radden Keefe, he is a great nonfiction writer, and so I was looking forward to checking this one out. This is a history of the Sackler family, who are, if you're not aware, they are the creators of OxyContin, which plays a huge role in the current opioid epidemic, and then also the history of the Sackler family with how they sort of revolutionized the way that drugs are advertised. The Sackler family is originally 3 brothers who were born in the early 1900s, And that's sort of the first half of the book or so is showing the creation of the rise of the Sackler family with the different businesses that they've created. The eldest brother, Arthur Sackler, grew up during the Great Depression, and so he was always trying to do all of these odd jobs, do all of these different things to earn money, and that sort of morphed into him creating all of these different businesses. He became a doctor. He was the one who revolutionized how drugs are marketed to doctors and to people. And his company created Valium, which was a huge drug at the time when he was still living. He died in 1987. And so the book follows up to the point where he dies and his younger brothers are still alive, but then it sort of shifts to more modern day Sackler family stuff and the creation of OxyContin, and they're just complete denial of how bad that drug actually was, and they just kept selling it even though they knew it was being abused. It's reading about rich people being bad people. It's not shocking in that sense. It's just so frustrating to read about them. And there's so many documents out there because this history has become public knowledge to a degree at this point. And there's all of these court documents over the years that Patrick Radden Keefe got access to. And so there is so much information. So sometimes it was to the point where it was a little too much, and I feel like he probably could have cut it down a bit and sort of compacted it, because there was so much about these people, because there's a lot of members of the family, they've got a lot of businesses, they've been around for a while. It's a lot of information, but it was still damn interesting to read about. The stuff with the Sackler family and the court cases, they're still ongoing as of the publication of this book. I feel like this book could have been a little bit better if it was written after everything was done. I can understand why it's not, because there is so much there, but there's no happy ending. There's no fantastic conclusion, a nice little cherry on top to all of this. It sort of just leaves you with this semi-icky feeling because there's no happy ending. There isn't for things in life. That's just the way it is sometimes. But just the scope of this book, all the things that it talked about, it was already something that I was really interested in. It all just came together in a really nice way to make this my top pick for my Octofinals group. That's everything. That's all my thoughts. I feel like I've been talking for so long. If you have read any of these books that I talked about in this wrap up, please let me know what you thought of them down below. If you happen to have also been assigned this category, this section of books, I'd love to know what your rankings were. As always, all of our links are in the down bar. You can go check those out if you feel so inclined. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you later.